Today is April 9th, 1995. The survivor is Mara Schwartz. The interviewer is Karen Leeds. We're doing the interview in New York City, USA, in English. Hi. Would you state your name, please?
My name is Mara Schwartz.
Can you spell that for me?
M-A-R-A-S-C-H-W-A-R-T-Z.
And your name at birth?
It was also Mara Schwartz, without the T.
Okay. Your mother and father's names?
My father's name was Rudolf Schwartz, and my mother's name was Dora Rosenkrantz.
And Rosenkrantz, how do you spell that?
R-O-S-E-N-K-R-A-N-Z.
Did you have any brothers or sisters?
I had a sister who died when I was 5 years old.
And her name?
Her name was Ellie Schwartz.
Okay. Can you tell me where you were born?
I was born in Vienna, Austria on December 22nd, 1925.
Mm-hmm. And what was the city in Vienna, or the place in Vienna? Do you remember your address?
My address was Schüttelstraße 21.
Schüttelstraße. Can you spell that for us?
S-C-H-U-T-E-L-S-T-R-A-S-S-E.
Does it have a meaning?
I don't think so.
And what, did you live in a house or an apartment?
An apartment.
Remember what it looked like?
Do I remember what it looked like? Exactly.
Yes. Could you tell me?
Well, it was a small apartment. It had an entrance hall with the kitchen to the right. You walked into a living dining room, and it had a bedroom off the living dining room and a small bathroom off the hall.
And what was the decor? What were the colors?
I don't remember the colors.
Did you have your own room? Did you share a room?
No. My bed was, when I was little, my bed was in my parents' bedroom, when I was very little. Although I don't remember it, I remember the bed somehow. I remember the crib and the side of the crib. When my sister died, and I was 5, I moved into the living dining room area, and I slept there. But until I was 5, I slept in my parents' bedroom.
And what did the living dining room area look like that you slept in?
I have to tell you that I barely remember it, and I think I made a point of forgetting it. I didn't want to remember anything about Vienna. And I think I tried to sort of blot it out. And other than some of the people who were part of my life, I remember very little.
And how old? You were 5 when you moved into that area?
No, I was 5 when my sister died.
Right, when you moved into the living room, I meant.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Yes.
And so at that time when you're 5 years old, did you have friends that you played with? Or?
My first memory is my sister's death.
Mm-hmm.
I remember my parents and my aunt, my father's sister, coming home and telling me that I will not see my sister again. It was my first memory. And I don't know what it meant to me, but it was obviously the first shock in my life. My parents became very depressed. I have stories of my cousins telling me about my parents' depression. And I guess my memory is sort of being totally abandoned by my sister, whom I loved, who disappeared, and then by my mother and father, because they mourned my sister's death. Obviously, at this point, I understand it. But I think it was hard when I was 5. And then life sort of resumed normally, as it was, until I was 12. I remember the school I went to in Vienna. I went to a Volksschule in the neighborhood, and then I went to a gymnasium. I was 12 when Hitler marched into Germany, into Austria, from Germany into Austria.
Was your family very religious?
Not very. They were religious up to a point. We had all the holidays. We had a kosher house. We went to synagogue on the holidays. I don't remember going every Shabbat.
What was your favorite meal?
Breakfast. I had breakfast with my father. Before he went off, he had a business, he had a store. Breakfast has always been my favorite meal. It's probably the only time I saw my father.
What did you usually have for breakfast?
Coffee with milk.
How
Oh
old
yes,
were you?
absolutely. I remember refusing to drink milk since I was old enough to say no. I hated milk. Also, you know, milk was not pasteurized milk. They used to bring it and boil it, and it developed a skin on top. And I hated that skin on top of the milk. And I would not drink milk.
The only way they could get you to drink milk was give you coffee.
Give me coffee with milk in it. I mean, it was café au lait, but I drank coffee with milk. And rolls, those sort of special rolls.
What kind of store did your father have?
My father had what was known as a dry goods store. I think he sold shirts, underwear, buttons, cufflinks, this sort of thing.
Did he come home late at nights? Or?
He must have come home very late at night because I remember him for breakfast.
Did he have a favorite meal that he ate every day at breakfast, or a set?
Not really. Not that I remember particularly.
What did you do with your mother?
My mother also helped my father in the store, and I think I spent more time with friends. I had a particular friend who lived around the corner, who now lives in Australia.
What was her name?
Irene. And I spent a lot of my time with her. I think that her parents had a housekeeper or a nurse or a nursemaid or whatever, and she sort of took care of the two of us. I spent a great deal of time with her.
And what did you do? Did you play certain games or
Well,
dolls?
we used to play games about, you know, little children in, maybe because I had male cousins and there were not too many girls around my family. I used to read a lot of Karl May, and he wrote stories about Indians and Apaches and white men who were helping Indians. And I read a lot of Karl May stories, and that's what we used to act out.
Cowboys and Indians? Or
Cowboys
just
and Indians. Well, it was not cowboys. It was, well, probably the white men were cowboys, but that's not how I remember it. I remember the Apaches and the Indians and the white men who were involved with the Indians, and we used to act it out. We used to play it out. And I would go to camp in the summertime, not for all summer. We would go for a couple of weeks, 3 weeks.
Where?
I don't remember, but I have pictures. You know, when we left Vienna, we had to leave very quickly, and I could carry very little. As a matter of fact, I remember sort of being told, well, you can carry whatever goes into this little suitcase, and deciding what was I going to take with me, not knowing what to take and what not to take. And I certainly took things that I barely remember what it was, but I do remember American movie stars, pictures of American movie stars.
And at camp, what were the activities? Was it boys and girls or only girls?
Only girls. I don't remember boys at camp. I was 12 when I left, so it was the summer when I was 10 and when I was 11. It was really a very ordinary life in Vienna. I had mostly Jewish friends, some not Jewish friends, because we went to school together. And one of my vivid memories was that once the Germans walked into Vienna, and we had to leave the school we all went to. We went to a different school where only Jewish children were taught. All my non-Jewish friends stopped talking to me. It's like I did not exist. I would see them on the street. They didn't say hello. They didn't talk to me. When I went to school, I remember, since Austria is a Christian country, they used to have a crucifix over the teacher's desk. And as soon as Hitler marched into Austria, they removed the crucifix that was over the teacher's head and put a picture of Hitler. And those are really, the memories I have left of those early years of my life have sort of been blotted out by the experience of the Austrians marching with their arms raised and yelling Heil Hitler, by the Germans walking in, by the reception of the Austrians of the Germans, by being displaced from school, by being rejected by friends. I don't think I have ever forgotten it or forgiven it. It certainly had a lasting effect on who I am.
Before this time in school, like when your first school, before you had to move to that other school, did you enjoy school? Was
Yes,
school something?
I did. I was a very good student. I remember one funny thing that I remember, I guess because it's funny, I broke a leg and I had a cast on my leg. And on the bottom, I guess the cast had a sort of piece of metal on the bottom. I mean, that's how they used to do casts in those years. And I used to run to school on this sort of cast with a piece of metal on the bottom and run just as fast as anybody else as I was going to school with this broken leg. I don't know why I remember that.
Did you have a favorite
I guess it was fun to sort of to prove that I could keep up with everybody else, even though I had a broken leg.
Did you have a favorite teacher?
I remember the principal of our grammar school. Somehow his picture is in my head. I don't remember his name. I don't know why I remember him particularly, but I remember his face. If you know, I really don't. I think that whatever good I experienced, and I'm sure there was some, I blotted it out.
Did you have a favorite subject?
Math. Definitively. Which was, I guess, also very unusual for girls in those years, and that sort of pleased me, that I was different, or, you know, that sort of appealed to me, even when I was 12, to be a little different. But I have as a matter of fact, my friend Irene from Vienna, whom I had not seen for 40 years. I've seen her, a few years ago, had all kinds of memories about our life together and all kinds of things. She said, don't you remember that? And don't you remember that? And I didn't. So I clearly went out of my way to blot it all out. And as a matter of fact, when we arrived in Belgium, after Kristallnacht, we left Austria and went to Belgium illegally by crossing the border at night. I refused to speak German. My parents spoke German to me. I certainly understood it, but I wouldn't speak it. And not until they were able to understand a little French was I willing to speak again. I only wanted to speak French. And I learned it very quickly.
You learned French when you were there?
Because I was a child, and you learn it very quickly. And I wanted to learn it very quickly. I did not want to speak German.
So the school that you were moved to, where was it located?
I don't remember. It was a local school. I mean, it was not in my neighborhood. In other words, I used to go to neighborhood schools when I was in Vienna. That school was somewhere else, because I remember crossing a bridge and walking much further.
Did you walk with someone or by yourself?
Probably with the people from the school, but I don't remember it. I have no memory of all of that.
How long were you at the school before Kristallnacht?
I think we were kicked out of school in the summer. Hitler walked into Austria in March. We were kicked out of our school in the, before maybe June. And or maybe not right away, maybe when the school year started again in September, we were not allowed to go back to our school. We had to go to a local school with volunteer teachers who were willing to teach Jewish children. But we left after Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht was in November. of 1938, and we left very shortly thereafter because after Kristallnacht, my father's store was confiscated. In other words, they put a lock over it and he could no longer enter it. So he had no way of making a living, and our apartment was confiscated. Somebody from the party walked in and took an inventory, opened all the drawers, everything that there was, you know, whatever we had, some silverware, some linen, books, whatever there was in the apartment, a radio. I mean, he just made an inventory of everything he saw. And then he handed my mother the list, and he said, well, you have to leave by, I don't know, November 1st or December 1st, I don't remember the date, and whatever's on my list must remain in this apartment. So we had no place to live and no way to make a living for my father. And so it was time to go. I'm sure my parents left reluctantly. They were not sufficiently wise to have made arrangements in advance or to have, although they inquired about coming to America. They went to the American embassy. I think the other thing that was going on is that I was 12 years old and no one talked to me. Who ever believed that 12-year-old children in those days had any feelings or worried about things or needed to know things? So I don't really know what they did. But I do know that after that, I was told that we would leave, that I went to see my grandparents.
Where were they?
They lived in Vienna. It was the last time I saw them. They died in Theresienstadt. I went to say goodbye to some of my other relatives, and we left. We took a train, went across Germany, where there was no more border between Austria and Germany, and arrived at the border at, I think it was Aix-la-Chapelle on the French side and Aachen on the German side.
Before we get there, what do you remember about your grandparents?
My grandfather was a religious Orthodox Jew. They were my mother's parents. My father's parents lived in Poland. I never met them. They died naturally. They died before the war. My father was one of 7 or 8 children, and all the children left Poland to come to Vienna. And no, that's not true. Some stayed in Poland. I never met them. My father left and came to Vienna when he was about 13. But I knew my mother's parents. Those are my mother's parents. And my mother had a brother, a sister, 2 brothers and a sister, and I knew all of them. And I was very close to them. My grandparents had a grocery store. And I used to love going there because they would always give me cookies and salami and food, and I just loved visiting because I was their only grandchild. So I was very spoiled by all of them, all my mother's brothers and sisters and my grandparents. And I remember my grandmother's apartment. She would keep it impeccably clean, unlike my mother, who was not so particular about her housekeeping. But my grandmother was, and that's one of the memories I have. They had to be very careful in my grandmother's house, because everything had to be always perfectly neat. I tend to keep after my grandmother. I'm always straightening things and cleaning things, and whenever anybody comes, my sons talk about it all the time. They're like, "Where's the glass?" Or, "She put it away already."
What did her house look like?
It was a small apartment, sort of in a way similar to ours. There was a hallway and a kitchen, only it was not on the right, it was on the left, and a living room and a bedroom. My grandfather also had a phonograph that he played a lot. My family was not particularly intellectual. So I don't remember a lot of books or a lot of literature or a lot of...
What kind of music did he listen to?
I particularly remember the Tales of Hoffmann that my grandfather used to play. and Jewish music. Sort of sad Jewish songs.
And your other relatives, what do you remember what they did or where they lived?
On my father's side, the family was somewhat more sophisticated, wealthier, more traveled, more learned. And I loved them because it was like a different world. And I was fascinated by it. In some way, my cousins were more sophisticated than I was. They would go skiing and they would do all sorts of exciting things that I only did once. As a matter of fact, the last year of my life in Austria, the winter before in February, before the march when Hitler marched into Austria, I went on a skiing trip. And all I had was my aunt's clothes, my aunt's outfit and my cousin's skis, and they sort of outfitted me, and I went skiing with my public school. I remember the trip with the teacher and the kids from the public school.
Were you good?
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, I think I won the booby prize because I was the last one. We had a slalom race at the end of this week of skiing, and I came in last. And so I got the prize for being last.
Did you get hurt at all? Did you fall a lot?
I fell a lot. Didn't get hurt, no, but I fell a lot. I remember stopping the skis by sort of sitting on them. You know, one way of stopping is you just fell on your skis and you sat on them. But I enjoyed it. It was sort of, because my cousins did that, and that was sort of the sophisticated thing to do.
Boy cousins, girl cousins?
Boy cousins.
Remember their names?
Oh, yes, very much so. I still see some of them, the ones that are still alive. Their name was Seidler, Harry Seidler, who is actually a world-famous architect in Australia. And his brother, Marcel, who died several years ago, but I know Marcel's children have come to visit, and I know them, I see them. And they were my closest relatives, really, I mean, younger. And I always looked up to them. They lived a sophisticated life. Mine was simpler.
So, and do you remember the night when your parents decided that they would have to leave?
Well, it was right after Kristallnacht. I mean, I remember Kristallnacht. I remember seeing the synagogues burn. I remember walking out on the streets and seeing the synagogues burn. And I just remember the feeling of, this can't be true. Cannot happen. It can't be. And I think it was then that I decided I was just going to forget about the whole thing. That I was not going to let it superficially interfere with my life. I was not old enough to know that by pushing it down, it interferes anyway, in some other way.
When you saw the synagogues burning or burned, was this the day after, or actually you saw the fires?
I think I actually saw the fires. It's, you know, after a while, it's difficult to be certain what you heard and what you really saw. My memory is that I really saw it. But I would not say 100% that I really saw it. But I think I really saw it. And the day after was, everybody was very frightened, and everybody listened to the radio, and they listened to Hitler make these mad speeches, and I remember the sound of the voice. I cannot tell you that I remember what he said, but the sound of the voice, I mean, I could hear it in the middle of the night, and I would tell you that's what it is. It has, that sound of his has never left me. And that sound has never left me, as well as the anti-aircraft sound I heard during the war. I mean, I can wake up in the middle of the night and sort of hear something and say, this is anti-aircraft. And then I said, no, it's not anti-aircraft, it's a motor on the street, but it's still in my head.
Do you remember what the streets looked like the day after? Anything specific?
The marching of the soldiers. And but again, you see, I'm not certain whether it's something I saw or something I saw later in movies, in newsreels, and think I've seen. I'm not certain. But I remember my parents saying that we must leave and that we must go and say goodbye to whoever there was to say goodbye to. And that we were leaving. And then I was told, here's a suitcase, whatever you want to take.
What color was your suitcase?
It was a leather suitcase, a sort of, tan leather suitcase.
And you said you took pictures of American movie stars?
Yes.
Who were your favorite American movie stars at the time?
I was madly in love with Robert Taylor, Tyrone Power, I don't know, Cornell Wilde. I mean, you probably don't even know them, or you've heard about them, but you don't know them. And Shirley Temple, absolutely, and Diana Durbin. And then there was somebody I used to, we still kid about this because Janet MacDonald, I used to call her Jeanette MacDonald, and for years everybody says, who is she talking about? Who is Jeanette MacDonald? Well, it's Janet MacDonald and Nelson Eddy were those are all people you probably never heard of.
They're actually my favorites.
Yeah. Well, I don't believe that.
I love old movies. But
oh yes, if you like old movies. And Diana Durbin I loved. I thought she was just wonderful. I had the fantasy that I looked like her.
What was your favorite movie of hers?
I don't know, but there was one with Stokowski. I don't remember the name of the movie, but I remember her singing and the orchestra and Stokowski conducting, and it was sort of my fantasy that that's what I could be like.
She took these pictures. Do you remember if you took like a special shirt or pants?
I don't remember. I really don't remember, but I know that it was very difficult for me to decide, and I think probably part of the decision was I'm not going to take anything. I mean, I took these movie because I felt like I had to take something, but that I couldn't decide. How could you decide what you're going to take? There was no way I could do that. And so I think I just sort of said to my mother, pack whatever you want, and I sort of snuck those pictures in on the bottom, and I didn't really want to get involved in it. It's sort of when I began turning off to all of that.
Remember what you were wearing when you had to leave?
No, do not.
And your parents, do you remember what they looked like, or when you were
Oh, well, I
leaving at that
remember what
point?
my parents looked like.
I mean the
but
clothes they were wearing.
No, not at all. I don't think I was aware of clothes or... No.
How did you get to the train station?
How did we get to the train station? I don't know. I remember sitting on the train for a long, long time, and I don't remember that. I think I remember mostly bad things. I remember arriving at the border, and we had no official papers to go into Belgium.
'95, we're interviewing Mara Schwartz. The interviewer is Karen Leeds. We're in New York City, New York, USA, and the language is English.
Okay, so let's go back to the platform. You're on the platform waiting for the train.
That part I don't remember. I remember the train ride. I remember some of that interminable train ride because it went
What
all
time of
through-
day?
It must have been, it was all daytime, so it must have been all through a day. I remember nighttime at the border,
And where did you sit?
at the window, looking out at the window, and I remember this interminable trip. And when we arrived at the border, we were told to get, well, originally, no, that's not how it went. First, we went to Aachen, where we were supposed to make contact with someone. You see, I didn't know the details. I mean, my parents knew all of this. We were supposed to make contact with someone, pay the money, and not a lot of money, but an average amount of money. I mean, like maybe a few $100s each, you know, not thousands of dollars. We didn't have lots of money. We had a little money, you know, not very much. And so we paid the sum of money to someone who then told us how to proceed across the border. That we are to take the train to the border, get off the train at the border, not to cross the border because we had no papers to get into Belgium, no official papers. To get off the border, to go through the gendarme, through the, what is it called? I can't think of the word in French, la douane. I can't think of it in English. Customs, thank you very much. You go off before you go through customs, thank you. And you then you let them take care, I mean, you let them check you out on the German side, and then you start walking on the road, and you will meet two men, and you will give them the password, and they will take you across the border. And so we went to the, and I clearly remember getting off on the German side, getting off the train, and then being examined by the German customs, or the German border police, really, is what I'm talking about.
How did they examine you?
The border police. First of all, they stripped you down bare. My memory is that I was menstruating, and that they went through the pad to look for, I know what. My mother gave me one of her rings to wear. They took it off my finger, put it into a Winterhilfe box, which is like a tzedakah box, but it was for Germany. Winterhilfe is help during the winter. They threw that ring into this box. They took whatever my mother had, and then they said, now you can go. And we started walking, and we saw, I was with my mother and father at that point, just the two of us, the three of us. And we saw these two men coming down the road. But before we got to them, a German soldier ran after us and stopped my mother. I was walking with my mother, and I think my father was ahead of us. That's probably why I said the two of us instead of the three of us. I think my father was walking a little bit ahead. And he said to my mother, I know you are going into Belgium illegally. I know that it's dangerous for you. If you come with me, I can take you a quicker way that the Belgians do not know. And up, there was a big hill, there was a railroad track and a big hill, and I'll take you up there. They can't do that. They have to walk on the road, which is much more dangerous, and I'll get you to that light, and that's the light where you have to be in order to be on the Belgian side. And my mother obviously did not know what to do with this. And there was sort of this conference between my mother and my father spoke to these two men who came along, who, when he gave them the password, was supposed to tell him what to do. And they told him, if this German soldier will take you across, you'll be better off with him. It is true that it's safer. He has a shorter route that we can't travel. And so we went with this German soldier who took us across the railroad track and who took us halfway up the hill, and he said, you go all the way up the hill to that light, and that's where they will meet you, they'll be there. And I often wondered why this guy did it. Did he do this every night? Did he do this? My mother was very beautiful. Did he do this because he thought my mother was beautiful? He wanted to help this pretty woman and her daughter?
Did money change hands at all?
No, he never asked for anything, not at all. Is this something that he did, you know, every night as people came along? I have no idea. But anyway, he did it for us. We were on the other side, those two Belgian people whom my father had seen there were all the way up on that hill. A little bit later, we had to wait for a while. They led us into that house, and in that house there were other people who had gone across the border illegally, and there were like several families, a few other children. I do not remember them at all. I just remember there were more people. And then they took us, we were walking again in the dark for not very long, 10, 15 minutes. And then we were on the Belgian side, and we could take a train into Aix-la-Chapelle on the other side of the border. It's Aachen on one side, it's Aix-la-Chapelle on the Belgian side. And from then on, we were in Belgium. Now, it was known about Belgium that once you arrived, they didn't ask you where you came from. In other words, they would not allow people to work in Belgium. They didn't give working permits. They didn't allow you to have a business, but they didn't ask you where you came from. So once you were there, you were safe. And when we were in Belgium, this was in 1938, the Germans did not arrive until 1940, and the war started again, and they did not really start pursuing Jews until 42 in Belgium. So we lived in Belgium, supported by the American Joint Distribution Committee. I'm recently reading the biography of the Warburgs. And the Warburgs were very influential in creating the American Joint Distribution Committee and supporting all the refugees in Europe, which is sort of an interesting aside to the story. It's like a detective story to read all about how they lived and, you know, the connection between the Warburgs and Germany and their life in Germany and so forth.
Where did you live?
We lived at first in Antwerp because my father had a brother who lived in Antwerp. And that's why we went. His brother was not able or willing to help us. I don't know which it was, but he did not. I was living with an American family. It was customary in Antwerp for Jewish families to take in refugee children. And since my parents lived in one room, and really there wasn't room for all three of us, my mother agreed to let me live with a Belgian family. The Belgian family happened to be an American family, and that's how I first heard my first English, was when I came to Belgium and lived with this American family. And they were talking English to each other, and I guess, I don't know what they were talking to me since I didn't speak French. That's when I learned it. I don't know, whatever. I was very miserable. I had never left my mother in my life. I was 12 years old, 12 and a half years old. I didn't know what hit me. And this Belgian family had a daughter my age who was a normal teenager who didn't know what hit her either when this little refugee girl showed up. I probably was crying all day long. I don't really remember, except I remember being very unhappy, particularly because I didn't understand. I didn't understand English. I didn't understand French. I didn't want to speak German. I didn't know what was going on, but I learned French very, very quickly. And I then, as soon as my parents were able to find an apartment that had 2 rooms rather than just one, I went back to live with them.
When you were alone, though, you had already started school at this time?
Well, the schooling that I had was very minimal, because when I first arrived in Belgium, I stopped school at the age of 12 and a half in Austria. When I went to Belgium, I didn't speak the language, so instead of being promoted to the next grade, they put me back 2 grades for me to learn French. And so I learned French in those years. Antwerp was bilingual. Now it's all Flemish, but in those years it was French and Flemish. I learned French very quickly, and then they put me ahead again, but there was no time, because then, I came at the end of 1938. During 1939, I tried to learn French, and in 1940, the Germans came again. So I never really had any kind of basic education. Essentially, between 1938 and 1946, those were lost years. I lost my whole adolescence. It was never really, I had the mentality of a child, and I think I maintained that until I was 20 or something like that, when I was trying to start catching up with.
How long did you live with this American family in
Just,
Belgium?
I would say, several months, 5, 6 months, until my parents were more settled into some kind of... And then I met other Belgian families who were, one of whom is still a friend of mine now. She married an American soldier and lives in New York, and I still see her. And she remembers me as this little refugee girl to whom she taught French. And they would come and pick me up and would take me to the movies and would take me, would take me in, and were wonderful to me. They would invite our family for Shabbat. Friday nights we would have with the Weinstock family, and they were very nice to us.
Do you remember where you lived when your family got an apartment?
I do not remember the name of the street in Antwerp. I know it was along the train passed above it. I do not remember the name of the street, no.
What did your mother and father do there?
Well, I think they tried to work illegally. By my father sort of tried to buy things and sell things, like a traveling salesman. The things that he knew, shirts, sweaters, the merchandise that he knew, that people would let him have, and he would then go out into the country to sell to smaller stores. I'm not really sure. I think we were mostly supported by the Joint Distribution Committee, by HIAS, the Hebrew Aid Society. I saw very little of my uncle and his family. I'm not sure why.
What What did you eat while you were there, or was it? Did you go shopping with your mother, or did your mother do it all?
I think they tried to teach me things to be able to earn a living. I learned how to sew. I learned how to make dresses. So I took a course with a dressmaker. I remember learning how to do manicures. See, the Koreans do it now, but it's not a new thing. It's what they used to do with refugees. They tried to teach refugee children things so they could make a living. I never did it for a living. I remember learning it, and it's not bad to know. So it was. I have very, very clouded memories of all that time. I remember going to the school where I went to school with very young children, because they put me back a couple of years, in order to learn French. It lasted a very short time. It was really just for 1 year. And then the Germans came again. Then the war broke out. And then my father was arrested because we had German passports. And the Belgians arrested him as a German. And they sent, as a matter of fact, he ended up in a camp in France, I think it was called Gurs, in the southern part of France. My mother and I tried to escape to France, running away from the Germans. Not that they didn't catch up with us. They never let us cross the border. We went to the Belgian border between Dunkirk on the French side and La Panne on the Belgian side, after Ostend. They never let us cross the border because we had German passports. They say Jew, but the Belgians didn't care about that. So at that time, I don't think they do. I mean, they didn't know what that meant anyway. It was a German passport, and that's all they could see. They would not let us cross the border. So my mother and I returned to Belgium. I returned to Antwerp from La Panne. We were there during Dunkirk while the British were fleeing. And that's where the anti-aircraft comes from. That's when we were sitting in the basement listening to the anti-aircraft and the bombing and the British getting away in Dunkirk, returning to London. And then the next thing, when we came out of the basement, were these troops walking through again. And nobody could believe that it was the Germans, but it was. It's like we thought it was the Dutch, or it was, who knew? Anyway, it was the Germans once again. So they caught up with us. We went back to Antwerp.
Were you there when your father was arrested?
I think my father was not arrested then. I mean, the Belgians sort of collected them, said you have to come to such and such a place, and he went. My father came back. How, I'm not certain. I think that as far as I know from the story, he lost a great deal of weight, but they didn't really watch them terribly. They didn't feed them, but they didn't really watch them. If they walked out of the camp, they could just leave. And he somehow came back. Talking about this, what it makes me feel is seems to have been very little communication between my parents and me. It's like they didn't tell me anything. And I was sort of lost. And that's how I remember the years, as sort of lost and repressed. I don't know what went on. I don't know who said what to whom. I don't know who went where. I don't know why. I have sort of snatches of memories, but I can't give you a total picture of it all. It didn't all come together in a way until I got married and had children, when I sort of felt like I had to pull it together in some way. And that's what I did. I went to school. I became educated. I learned about Judaism. I learned about being Jewish. I wanted. You told me I would need it. I wanted my children not to feel about being Jewish as I felt, that it was difficult, terrible, persecution. That's not what I wanted to pass on. I wanted to pass on that it was joyous, that you could celebrate holidays, that you could learn what it means to be Jewish in a positive sense. That to be Jewish has to do with being generous, giving tzedakah, taking care, learning about contributions of Judaism to Western civilization. I wanted all the positive parts of it. And the only way to do it is to learn about it. I knew nothing about it. I mean, I was a little girl, I went to synagogue, I sort of used to ask my father questions, and he would say, well, we do it because we're Jewish. Well, what does that mean? I knew nothing. And I suddenly realized I couldn't pass it on unless I learned something. And so I went out and learned. I had to know about it. And what I wanted to pass on was the good part of it. I didn't want them to be Jewish because we are persecuted. I wanted them to be Jewish because we celebrate it, because it's a good thing to be. And it wasn't really until I hit that point that I sort of feel like I was able to pull it all together, who I was and what I wanted to do.
How old were you in Antwerp? You were there
in
2
Antwerp,
years?
I was born in 25, but at the end of 25. So in 1940, I was 14. And when I came to this country, I skipped a lot.
Did you have friends in Antwerp?
Antwerp, I had friends, yes. I had some friends who were also refugees. But I didn't want refugee friends. I wanted Belgian friends. I wanted to be like everybody else. I didn't want to be a Jewish refugee. And I made Belgian friends. I went out of my way to meet Belgian friends.
And what did you do with them?
What did we do? We went ice skating, which I learned in Vienna. We didn't really, what did we do? Once I learned French, I sort of have this memory of discussing, being totally ignorant of lots of things, but having these philosophical discussions. You know, French children, Belgians are like French. They talk a lot. You know, if you know the Roma movies, the French people get together, they always have these big philosophical discussions. I'm not sure they know what they're talking about. I certainly didn't know what I was talking about. That's what I remember. And we used to always end up every discussion with tout est relatif. I mean, you know, nothing matters. Everything is relative. And it was sort of, it made me feel like I was like everybody else. And that was more important than anything to me. And that's why when, at the end of the war, the most important thing for me was to get away from all of this. And I married an American soldier. I came here as a war bride. It's just that once I got here, I realized that that's not really who I was. And that's not really, you know, he was not Jewish. And I lived in a non-Jewish world with very nice people, but they were totally foreign to me. And it was then that I realized I had to sort of take stock and find out who I really was.
So you were in Antwerp for 2 years, and where did you go next, and how did you get there?
After Antwerp, the Germans started taking people into sort of collection areas where they then sent them on trains to concentration camps. We didn't really know what that meant, but we knew to avoid it. And so we left Antwerp, which had lots and lots of Jews living in Antwerp. And we left Antwerp and went to Tilf. And we went to Tilf, which was a small town outside of Liège, because I knew a Belgian family there whom I had met when we were trying to run away to La Panne. And in those years, once I had learned French, my parents spoke very poor French. I was sort of the trendsetter. I mean, like, whatever I said we should do, we did. And so I said, well, we got to get out of Antwerp. My father had come back from the camp. Let's go to Liège. So we went to Liège, and again, you know, you look for a Jewish community. They didn't really know what to do with us, but they said, well, if you go to Tilf, it's outside of Liège, life is cheaper, apartments are cheaper, whatever, housing is cheaper. We ended up in Tilf. And again, my father ended up by buying and selling goods that he could get from wholesalers, and then he would go around with his little suitcase and sell things. He made enough money to support us. Not very well, but, you know. And we lived in Tilf. And it was in 1942 when the Germans again started pursuing Jews, not only in Antwerp and Brussels, in Liège as well. At that point, we got our papers. First, I worked in a weapons factory. First, we got papers to do forced labor in a weapons factory. And there, too, I traveled with other Jewish children that I knew. Actually, two of the Weinstock daughters, whom I knew from Antwerp, also had ended up near Tilf. It's a sort of disjointed story, but that's how I remember it. We traveled into Liège to go to this weapons factory. And again, we were separated. All the Jewish forced labor was separated in a room, and we were testing parts of weapons. And in other words, the little piece of metal that was part of a automatic rifle, let's say, I don't really know what it was, but part of something else, some weapon, had to fit through this part, but not through that part. You know, you had a gadget in your hand, it had to go through here, but not through there. Then it was the right thickness. And then you threw them into a pile. That was a good piece. And I remember we had a quota. You had to do 10,000 a day. Well, by the time, after 10, I'm not sure it was 10,000, 3,000 a day. After 3,000, we decided, well, now we're going to throw the good ones into the bad ones. I mean, we were doing sabotage, even at that time, as much as we could. And that lasted for several months. At one point, the Gestapo came and wanted to take all the Jews that were working in this weapons factory and take them away. And my friend Esther, who is the one, you know, I told you, who married an American and came to this country from Antwerp, was also there. And she was, they were Belgian Jews, not refugees. And she went to the manager, the Belgian manager of the factory, and said, you know, you have a quota to make, and if you let all these Jewish workers be taken away now, you're not going to make your quota, and it's going to be bad for you. And so he decided, well, this was true, she was right, and maybe he better not let these Jewish workers be taken away so easily. And so there was a counter order. But in the meantime, those people who had already gotten onto the trucks were on the trucks. There were 5 people in front of me, mounting onto the trucks to be taken away to concentration camps, or to some camp we did not know where in those years. We just knew it was not good, but we didn't know what. And so there was a counter order. We went back to work. At that point, I decided I was not going to go back anymore, that I escaped today by 5 people, but I wasn't going to escape the next time. And so I went to somebody in Tilf, who's in Hill. I was as a friend of mine, in whose house I overheard conversations about communism and underground. I heard people talk in the background. And so I decided, well, I was going to find the underground, and I was going to tell them to take care of us. But how do you find, who's the underground? How do you find the underground? So I went to, because I had overheard conversations in that household, I went to the father of this family and I said, I'm looking for the underground. I need to be helped.
In 1995, we're interviewing Mara Schwartz. The interviewer is Karen Leeds. We're in New York City, New York, US of A, and the language is English.
Okay, so you said, I need to be helped. What did he say?
I need to be helped. And he said, why? And I told him the story about the Gestapo coming after, that we were working in the weapons factory, and I actually did skip a few things, and that was that we had all received our before I worked at the weapons factory, we had all received our papers while I was working at the weapons factory, we also received our papers to go to Malines, which was a barracks, an army barracks, where it was outside of Brussels, between Antwerp and Brussels, where they collected all the Jews that they wanted to then send on trains. They didn't send every 10 people. They collected a whole train full before they sent them off to a concentration camp. We had received these papers. I was working at the weapons factory while we received these papers.
And that means you and your family?
Yes,
okay.
My mother and father and I. And at that time, that was when I went looking for the underground. And I said, we need help. We received these papers. And I was then told that they would take care of my parents, but that while I was working at the weapons factory, I was safe. And they had too many people to take care of, and they would take care of my parents. They sent my mother and father into Liège to a contagious ward of a hospital, because the Germans don't go on contagious wards. And from there, they went to other places. My mother went to a convent, and my father was sent to via a priest to some farm in the country. I was still at the weapons factory. Then the incident happened with the truck, where I almost was taken, and then I went back and I said, I'm not going back to that factory anymore.
How old are you now?
Now I need help. And they said, yes, now we'll help you, because now we agree. It's too dangerous for you to go back, because, you know, today you escape, tomorrow they'll come back for you.
How old are you now?
This was in the summer of 43, and so I was 18, not quite 18. In the winter I would have been 18. I was 17.
So when did you left Antwerp in
I left Antwerp in 42.
42?
I was 14 when the Germans came in 1940. I left in 42. At that point, when the underground, or the people in the underground took care of my parents, and then I was first sent to the mayor of the village of Tilf, who was a member of the underground. I knew his daughter, and I was up in the attic. But it was really untenable because people came into his house, people in the village knew me, they heard steps, they felt that it was too dangerous. They had to send me somewhere else. So they sent me to another family in Liège, and I was in the back room of a family that I had never seen in my life before, and I was just sitting there crying my eyes out because I had nothing to do, I didn't know what to do with myself, I didn't know where my parents were. I had friends in Brussels, I didn't know what had happened to them. Who went from Antwerp to Brussels. When we went to Tilf, they went to Brussels. People sort of try to move thinking that if they move, they won't be found to begin with. And so I was very unhappy, and it was a very nice Belgian family, and the woman said to me, well, you know, if you're going to sit here and cry all day long, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to go to Brussels. I want to go to my friend. I can't stand being alone. So they gave me money to take the train to go to Brussels. I mean, they couldn't control me. They couldn't say, you can't go. At that point, I did not have false identification papers yet. It was at that moment that they said, well, if you're going to start traveling around, you have to have false papers instead of, you know, my regular identification paper, which everyone had in Belgium. Everybody walked around with IDs. And so I got my false identification papers, and it was at that point I mentioned to you previously that my name, the initials were reversed. They ask for your initials in order to make papers with your own initials. So in case you have anything that has initials on, you give them your real birth date with the feeling that if somebody stops you and says, when were you born, that you're not going to remember a wrong date. You're going to remember the real date. So I had false identification papers with my birth date, a different place, obviously not Vienna, Austria. I was born in Belgium somewhere. And they reversed the initials. Instead of MS, they made it SM, and so it became Simone Mabier. And from then on, I was Simone, which was also very strange. Suddenly, Mara was gone and there was Simone. But I have to tell you, I was so confused anyway, that it was just another level of confusion. I then went to Brussels, to my friend's house. It turned out, of course, that they were also in hiding, that they already had a niece that whose parents had been arrested, who was living with them, and my friend's mother certainly didn't want another child to take care of. I wasn't a child anymore, another young adult to take care of. But there was someone in where they lived, in the building, a painter, a Belgian painter, who had a young family, a son and a daughter. And he said, okay, you can come and live with me. And he used me as a model. And somewhere in Belgium, there are paintings of me. I mean, he may have never sold a single one, and they may be in someone's basement. Somewhere in Belgium, I was a model for a painter for a few months. And then people in the neighborhood began saying, oh, this is dangerous, you can't really keep her. You know, you have children, and what's going to happen to you? You can't do that. So they asked me to leave. So then I left again.
While you lived in this neighborhood, did they call you Simone Mabier, or did they call you...
Simone. Once I had those papers, it was Simone.
How do you
with my
spell
friends,
that?
It was Mara. With them, it was Simone. It was very confusing.
How do you spell Simone Mabier?
Simone is S-I-M-O-N-E, and Mabier was M-A-B-I-E-T. And then I found another place, and I sort of did this on my own because I really didn't want to leave Brussels, where I had friends, where I wasn't all alone. And I then found a place in a family that had a newborn baby, and I took care of a newborn baby, and that I remember as wonderful. I mean, there was a little creature that I sort of, my very own, that I could take care of. But it didn't last very long, because they felt, one of their neighbors said, how can you do this? I had no ration cards, I had no ration stamps. It was clear that I was illegal. It was clear that I was not born to be a nanny. So it didn't look right. And so they again asked me to leave. I went many places. And finally, my friend were arrested. The Gestapo came for them. They found them, I don't know how, but they came. My friend and his mother were taken. His father and brother were not, because they weren't home. So the father and brother were away from home, not taken. My friend and his mother was taken. They were taken to the Gestapo headquarters. They were taken to Malin and on the train into Auschwitz or somewhere.
Your friend, what was his name?
His name was Heinz Kravitz.
And how did you meet him?
He was in the camp with my father in Gers, when all Belgian Jews were. And my father used to talk to him about me. And so when he came back, he looked for my father and for me. And that's how I met him.
And what did he do?
He was also very young. I mean, I was close to 17. He probably was 18 or 19. But he was trained to be a watchmaker. Just as, I was trained to be a seamstress, do manicures. He was trained to be a watchmaker. And his father was a jeweler. He came from Berlin, and his father was a jeweler. They did have a jewelry store, so somehow watchmaking and jewelry is sort of related. But who knows what he would have been. I mean, none of us were educated. None of us had any schooling from very young because of all the upheavals. He was taken, and I've heard the story subsequently, and I'm not sure how. But I think it was from someone who was on the train with him. He always had planned with his brother that if they were arrested and if they were sent away on the train, they would jump. They would jump the train. They would come back. They would meet each other. They always said that. And they had a place where they would meet. And his brother, who was not taken, went to that area, some park in Brussels, for weeks on end. He never came back. And subsequently, we had heard from someone who did come back that he wanted to jump, as he had promised his brother he would do, and that his mother said, "Don't leave me." This is the story I heard. And so he didn't jump. And I've never heard about it again. I've heard that story several months after he was arrested. I think my memory is that somebody did come back from that train with that story. But I'm not certain anymore how that story came to me. So where was I? I lost it.
You had just moved from being the nanny.
Oh, right. And then I left, once he was arrested. You see, I was also in contact with my parents, but never directly, because I didn't know where they were. We had a contact, and my parents would write to the contact, and I would write to the contact, and then they would exchange. The contact knew where we were. And that was done so that in case any one of us is arrested, we don't know. Nobody, I could not give away where my parents are if I didn't know where they were. And so I wrote to my mother saying that I wanted to leave Brussels once he was arrested. And I was sort of going from pillar to post. I had no reason to stay in Brussels. And my mother was in a convent. My mother was with Les Sœurs de la Miséricorde in Charneux. And my mother asked the Sister Superior if I could come there. And she said that would be okay. And so somehow, again, through the contact in the underground, they let me know. And they let me have some money so I could take a train. Then I had some incidents on the train because they stopped people all the time. but I had false papers, and there was this German soldier who sort of took my card. And you know, we also knew that false identification cards came from certain villages, because only certain villages were willing to provide them, and that the Germans knew that. Now, they didn't know all of the villages, so you never knew when you were arrested with a false card whether the German wasn't going to figure out that this was a false card. And I was on the train to go to my mother, to the convent where she was in Charneux, and Germans checked trains all the time, streetcars, trains. I had an incident on the streetcar as well, but I'm mixing it up. Okay, on the train, the guy, German soldier, comes by, gets everybody's identification card, and looks at them, and then he looks at mine, and he looks at me, and he looks at the card, and he looks at me, and I said, oh my God, what does he see? And he suddenly gives it back to me, and he says, Simon is a very nice name. And he gave it back to me, and he was gone. I don't know what he was looking at. But I don't know. But I was very scared.
What was the incident on the streetcar?
The incident on the streetcar was I was still with my friend in Brussels. And we were on the streetcar. We all had false papers. No, this was before the false papers. This was before the false papers. Because, again, the Germans stopped the streetcar, and they came looking for identification cards. And my friend and I looked at each other, and he said, we have to get off the streetcar. And I said, I can't get off the streetcar. The streetcar was going. He said, jump. And I said, I can't jump. There's no way that I can jump off a moving streetcar. And somehow the streetcar came to a stop. And so the two of us got off that streetcar in a second and ran. And the next day we went back to see whether that was a streetcar stop. And it was not. So obviously the conductor stopped in case anybody had to get off the streetcar. I mean, this was done in Belgium all the time. You know, the people in the underground sort of knew how to foil the Germans as best as possible. And so we just got off and ran, and nobody caught up with us that one time.
Is that what made you decide to get false papers?
Well, no, I think the false papers had to do with you had to wait for them. You know, we were in the process of getting them, but you didn't get them right away. You sort of have to wait till they come through, till they're approved, etc. That incident was before papers because we didn't have any, which is why he said, we better get off the streetcar.
So now you're on your way to the convent.
Now I'm on the way to the convent with my mother. At that point, the convent was a children's home. It had small children. It was sort of like an orphanage, really. And my mother worked there with the sisters in the convent, doing whatever, laundry, ironing, I mean, whatever children need. And I worked with the children. But I was also very susceptible to all kinds of diseases, and any childhood disease that we went through this convent, I got. And so I got scarlet fever. And I was already 18, and that's a rather dangerous illness at that age. And I was very ill. I was deathly ill, and they really didn't know what to do with me. As a matter of fact, I remember that the sisters had put all kinds of things around my neck, I don't know, garlic or onions or something. I was supposed to chase the disease away. And when the doctor came, he sort of ripped it off my neck and said, what are you doing to this girl? She needs medication, not onions and garlic that I had around my neck. But they were very frightened that I would die, because if I did die, they wouldn't know what to do with the body. You know, I was illegally there. Well, I didn't die. I somehow recovered. Although I was very ill. I remember being really out of it for a long time. I caught all kinds of diseases. I had something called impetigo, where you have all kinds of skin. It's a skin eruption. And the medication that they had that I would put on would turn black. So I used to have this black cream all over my face. It was pretty horrendous. I had diphtheria. Like every disease that went through that children's home, you could be sure that I would get. And at one point, this is over several months, this is not a long time that I'm talking about. I sort of went from one disease to another. And then there were too many Germans in the village, and they decided they had to change us again. And I had to, you know, there was They were afraid that once they saw too many Germans around, that they would come, they might ask the convent, they might ask the villagers, they might ask too many questions, and they moved me again. And that's when I went to Banneux Notre Dame.
Did you become close with anyone in the Sisters Marie de Croix?
One Belgian woman, a young woman, who came there to help out, who lived in town, sort of. And the nuns. Many of them were very good to me. I mean, there were some nasty ones and some, like anywhere else. There were some nasty ones and some not so nice ones, and some very nice ones.
When you weren't sick, what did you do there?
When I was working with the children, you know, taking them for a walk, playing games, wiping their noses, working with the children's home, all kinds of things like that. And then I was sent to Banneux Notre Dame. And that's when I met the priest. Banneux Notre Dame was a small village in Belgium where the Virgin had appeared in the 30s. It was said that the Virgin appeared in the 30s, and the young girl to whom she appeared came to this priest called Louis Jamin, that was his name. And it was a recognized cult to the Virgin in Belgium. It was not as recognized as Fatima or as Notre Dame de Lourdes, but it was a recognized apparition. And he was the chaplain of, you know, I know he was the chaplain of the small chapel that was built for this, for the apparition of the Virgin. Somehow I got to know him. I'm not certain really how, unless he probably was also part of the underground and he sort of knew that I was one of the... There too, I was Simone all the way through. This is a period, I'm telling you, it's all very short really. It's sort of from 42 to 44. So I was in Banneux for a few months, and now I'm in Charneux for a few months, and now I'm in Banneux. But it was just months.
Did you go with or without your mother?
Without my mother.
So your
I
mother
was
has
with my
stayed
mother
there?
for several months. They sent her to a convent in Liège from Charneux. She went to the main convent in Liège, and I was sent to Banneux Notre Dame.
And during this time, have you gotten any letters from your father while you were
No, we did not. I mean, we knew sort of that he was all right. It's like, you know, the underground would let us know he's okay. Don't worry about him.
So before you went to Banneux, you were with your mother for those few months.
A few months I was with my mother.
What did you speak about? Did you spend a lot of time together, or?
Not too much, because, you know, we worked all day. I remember sleeping in the same room with my mother, but I don't remember really. My mother had her job to do, and I had my job to do, and then I was sick a lot of the time. So I was really in the infirmary a lot of the time, and since these were all contagious diseases, they wouldn't let her come and see me. So I was not really, I mean, I was with her and I was not with her in a way. But I became more and more estranged from my parents as the years went by, because I felt so untaken care of. I mean, so unprotected. And that only what I did on my own sort of helped me. And I became enormously, superficially, very independent. I mean, I subsequently found out how superficial it really was, but I thought I was very independent. My husband always kids me that by the time I met him, I had used up all the quota of independence, and I just finished. It's his job now. I had used up too much. But so then I was in Banneux Notre Dame, and this was also a children's home. Children were slightly older, and for a few months, and then the Germans. It was September of '44. The Germans were defeated, and I saw my first Americans.
But you said you had become close with one of the priests
Yes.
in Banneux Notre Dame. Can you tell us about him?
He was a very unusual man. Those were the time when I was very vulnerable and very interested in Catholicism. And I mean, after all, I was in a convent for several months. I went to church every day. It was wonderful. It was peaceful. The nuns' voices were beautiful. Going to church was heaven. It was terrific. It was peaceful and lovely. And I was totally accepted. I mean, nobody made me feel that I wasn't wanted. And so by the time I got to Charneux, I wanted to learn all about it, and I wanted to read the Bible, and I wanted to learn about Catholicism. I mean, I was not, in no way did I know that there was a connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's not something I knew then. And I was ready to be converted on the spot. And although he was very interested in me and he wanted to teach me about Catholicism, and his point of view, of course, was that the New Testament is the fulfillment of the Old, and that he would find all the passages in the New Testament that fulfilled the Old and that proved that Christ was the Savior. He also said to me, if I would not convert you now, if you want to be converted, come back after the war, and then we'll talk. And I guess he knew what the truth really was and why I wanted this, and that you can't do it, not with full conscience. And so I corresponded with him for many years, and until he died, which was a long time ago. I think he died in the early 60s. But I corresponded with him all these years.
What were your living quarters like there?
It was a requisitioned hotel that the children lived in. And there's another tale there when the Germans were finally gone, and it was clear that the Americans, because we were on a road where you could see German troops and then American troops and then German troops and American. And finally, the Germans were all gone, and all we saw was Americans. The women whose hotel it was requisitioned by, they let it be requisitioned for the children's home, because otherwise the Germans would have requisitioned the hotel. So they would just as soon have the children's home and the nuns have it than the Germans. So it was very pleasant, actually. And they had in the basement a wine cellar of wonderful wine. So they were celebrating the end of the war. And we were all drinking wine. And of course, I had never had wine in my life before, or if maybe on Shabbat a sip, or on Passover 4 sips. And so I became, obviously, my tongue loosened. And I told them all that my name was not Simone, that it was Mara, and who I was. No one there knew who I was. The next day, I shared a room with one other not refugee, another Belgian girl who worked in the company. She told me the next time, she said, you better stop pretending, because we all now know who you are. I had no recollection of having said anything to anybody. But very soon, maybe not the next day, but 3 days later, I left in my usual independent way, and I hitchhiked into Liège, and I went looking again for my contact in Liège, who would put me in contact with my parents, because that was in 1944. Belgium was liberated until Bastogne again, until the Battle of the Bulge, but there were no more Germans in Belgium.
I remember you saying about seeing your first American.
Yes,
what
my first American were minesweepers. They came off the hills right in front of our building. They were running down the hill, and they had minesweepers, these long things with a circle at the end, to find out whether the road is mined or not. Those were the first Americans I saw. And then I left the convent, I left this children's home, and I went to Liège. This was now 1944. And then I started working for the American Army.
Did you find your contact in Liège?
Yes. I found my contacts in Liège because I sort of knew where they were. And I was put in contact with my parents, who then also came to Liège. And they gave us an apartment, and we lived in Liège. I then started working for the American Army.
Did you speak to your father about his experience while he was at the farm?
Yes.
What did he say?
My father was in the farm only for a while, and then he was in the priest's house. And in the priest's house, he was for a long time. It was also occupied by the Germans on the bottom, and he was up in the attic, and he had to pretend that he was deaf-mute so that they wouldn't talk to him, so they wouldn't ask any questions. And my mother went from convent to convent. I pushed her around in several convents as well. She was always working with the nuns, you know, different jobs. At one point she was they had a senile countess who was living in the convent, and my mother was her companion. Because this senile lady used to walk in anywhere. She thought she was in her chateau. And so my mother had to stop her from going into any room she wanted to go to, which was not exactly what the sisters had in mind. And then
The date is April 9th, 1995. We're interviewing Mara Schwartz. The interviewer is Karen Leeds. We're in New York City, New York, US of A, and the language is English.
Okay, so it's after the war, and you're living
right,
with your
we
mother
were
and father.
liberated. I'm living with my mother and father.
And where are you living?
In Liège. And I find it very difficult. I find it very difficult to settle down to being someone's child who has to account for what she does or doesn't do or where she goes. And I found it very difficult to sort of, and I guess my parents who lost a 12-year-old thought I was still a 12-year-old, but I really wasn't. And I had had a very difficult few years, and I found it very difficult. And so I left. I left, which was really almost an unheard of thing to do, because people didn't leave home. They got married. They didn't leave home. But I went to Namur, and I worked for an American PX. And I learned English. You forgot to ask me how I learned English. I didn't know English. I just sort of decided I was going to speak English, and I was going to pick it up. And I went to a lot of American movies, not dubbed, in English. And I remembered all that English I heard when I first came to Belgium and lived with this American family. And I guess it all just fell into place. And I have no memory at all of ever having learned or studied English. It's like I was born speaking English or something. I don't know. It obviously is not true. And I'm obviously forgetting what it was like, but I don't remember it.
What did your parents say to you when you told them you were leaving?
They didn't know how not to let me go. They just, I think I was just more than I could deal with. They didn't quite know what to do with me.
Did you find an apartment?
I first lived with a Belgian family. I lived with a family. I had a friend who lived in Namur, whom I met somewhere, a very nice young woman, and I lived with her for a while. And then I found a room somewhere, and I worked, and I sort of supported myself. And so that was, it was just the way it was. I can't say it any other way.
And what did you do?
But I could not stay home anymore. I just couldn't deal with it. And I think it was difficult for my parents, and they had a difficult time. And they had a difficult time with each other, and they fought a lot. I couldn't stand it. I just couldn't take it. And so I moved away. And I was in Namur during the Battle of the Bulge when the Germans came back again. And I was working for the American Army, and I was scared stiff. And everybody said, "Don't worry, nobody's going to abandon you."
What did you do for them?
I worked at the PX.
But what were your duties?
Office work. I mean, I typed, I kept records, I was just a general clerk, which also I never really learned. I just sort of picked it up. I made up some shorthand that I made up myself. I taught myself how to type on a typewriter. I mean, it's not that difficult. You just pick it up.
How fast did you wind up typing?
Typing very fast, but not then. I mean, eventually I typed very fast. Although, you know, you lose it. You learn it and you lose it. As I told you, I ended up being writing software for the New York Stock Exchange. Just anyway, um, that's a much later, much later.
So now you're working for the PX and the Battle of the Bulge is
Yes,
happening.
and actually, while I was working for the PX, I also worked for an American chaplain, also in his office. You know, doing office work, really, keeping records and typing and...
Did you tell them of your experiences during the war?
Well, those who were interested, yeah. I'm not sure. Some Americans were interested in it. Yes, I certainly did not hide it. But again, that's not what I wanted. I wanted somehow to find a normal life. I just didn't want all this. I wanted to get away. And I married an American who was working for... He was already discharged. He was an American civilian who was working for the American Battle Monuments Commission. Whatever they did, I'm not quite sure. Putting up American battle monuments, I guess, or keeping track of them or something. And I was married in Belgium. My father was very upset because he was not Jewish. But I think they didn't quite know how to stop me. They
What was
had
his
no
name?
way of stopping me. His name was Russ Bowman, and he was a very nice man. I was very lucky because I think I would have married anybody who asked me, and he could have been awful, but he happened to have been a very nice man. Came from Kalamazoo, Michigan, the salt of the earth. I mean, true American in every sense of, in all the good sense that you can ever imagine. And so was his family. I mean, they were just wonderful. But they knew nothing about Jews or Judaism. It was also a time when the Holocaust was not discussed, was not talked about. It was really Elie Wiesel who started the ball rolling with, when he wrote The Jews of Silence of Russia, and he wrote his own books. That's really when it became part of the consciousness of the world. Up until then, nobody talked about it. Nobody, you know, they were very nice to me, but if I said I didn't want to go to church, I mean, that would be bizarre. Why did you marry Russ if you don't want to go to church? He was a church-going person. And so I tried it for a while, but it wasn't me. And I was very miserable. I went home to Belgium again to be with my parents. And my father very sensibly said to me, if you want to come home, you can come home, but you have to get a divorce. You can't just stay here as a married woman. Who are you? What are you? You have to go back, and if you get a divorce and you want to come home, that's okay. But I did come back here, and I did get a divorce, and it was very difficult for me, because it was very difficult for me to be alone, but I had to do it. And the first thing I did was I joined a Jewish community center. I lived in Washington, D.C. I worked in Washington, D.C. And I joined a Jewish community center in Silver Spring, Maryland, because I really lived outside.
What made you go to Washington, D.C.?
My first husband works in Washington. He was from Kalamazoo, but he worked in Washington, D.C. We lived in Washington. I've always lived in Washington when I first came here. And I stayed in Washington until I was married until 50. I was married from 47 to 53. And I came to New York in 1954 because it was quite obvious that what I wanted was to find a Jewish husband. And in Washington, D.C., there are more women than men. And in my usual independent way, I went about finding a Jewish husband. I had to come to New York, that's where you'll find a Jewish husband. And so I worked, when I came to New York first, I had a contact. I worked in Washington for Frieda von Reichmann, who was a psychiatrist at Chestnut Lodge. It's a private mental institution. And it was sort of the beginning of my learning about life. I learned how to set a table. I learned how to entertain, how to have friends, because I was her private secretary, and that's sort of what I did for her. But I learned it from her. And she was very attached to me, and I was very attached to her. But she understood that Washington was not the right place for me, and that I should leave and I should come to New York. And she spoke to a few people about me, and I found a job really because she had talked about me to someone, and I worked for a doctor at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry. And that's where I met my husband, Lester, who was then the chief resident at Einstein in '55.
And where are your parents during all this?
My parents stayed in Belgium until 1952, when I brought them over, because they really didn't want to remain in Belgium. I was married in '47. I became a citizen in '49. They sort of felt I was their only child, and since I was here, they wanted to come here. My father died very soon after he came here. They came in '52, he died in '53. It was very hard for him to readjust to another language, another country, he couldn't quite do it. My mother was much younger than my father, and she did fine. She, was around. She knew my sons. My father never did.
Where did she live?
She lived in Brooklyn. My mother was very close to us when once, I was married and I had children. She was here a lot and was very close to the children. And so I was married in '57. And that's when I no longer needed to support myself. And the one thing I wanted to do was go to school, which I hadn't done for a long time, since I was 12 and a half. And so I took a high school equivalency exam, and then a college entrance exam. And because I had no credentials, if in order to go to college you have to have a high school diploma, but I've never gone to high school. So I had to take all these exams, and then they didn't quite know what to do with me because I had okay test results, but I had none of the background. So they decided to send me to the French department, so they should evaluate what to do with me. And so at that point, I spoke English quite well, and I walked into the French department speaking not French, but English. I don't know why. It was easier for me. Since French is not my mother language, you see, I rejected German, but French is not my mother language. So although I speak French, doesn't come naturally to me. And so the first thing the man said to me is, "Where did you learn English?" And I said, "I didn't." "Where did you study English?" I said, "I didn't. I just picked it up." He said, "You'll be fine. You'll pick up anything. We'll take you. You don't have to do any prerequisites. Just start college. You'll pick it up." And so I started at Hunter until I was pregnant with my first son. And then I dropped out and had 2 children. And then when they no longer needed me, 10 years later, after I went, through having both as small children, I went back to school and didn't really graduate until '76.
How old are you then?
I was born in '25. In '76, I was 50. Yes. And so that's when I started feeling, I had to have a job. Now that I've gone to college, I have to have a job. And that's when I took a computer course. And I went to, but it was really not until I had children that I began feeling that I had to pull together what I wanted to pass on. And that I had to decide who I was. And although my early years really sort of left me almost incapable of, I think, the trauma of not having had an adolescence. I really didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I was interested in. I didn't, it's when you are 17 and 18 that you read something that turns you on, those are the years that make you who you are. You learn from literature. You learn from none of this has happened to me, and so I was really very, very detached. And it's having children that made me feel that I had to become attached to something that I can pass on. And that's when I started learning about Jewish things and Judaism. And I became very active in the Reconstructionist movement, which is, it's one of the Jewish branches you don't hear much about. It's not conservative, it's not Orthodox, it's not Reformed, it's Reconstructionist. But it meant a great deal to me because it is very traditional in form, but it reinterprets the meaning of the tradition into, more modern, more rational sensibilities that I have acquired over the years, rather than the old-fashioned way of looking at religion and God. And so, I guess the only feeling that I have is that because of my need to prove that if Hitler had killed me, none of this would have happened. What I do now has to be in defiance of it all. I have to prove that there was a reason for surviving, because otherwise the guilt for having survived is very difficult. And the reason for surviving is to have Jewish children and Jewish grandchildren. That's quite a burden to put on your children. But I can't help it. There it is.
So you took a computer course.
Yes.
And what did you wind up doing?
I ended up working for the New York Stock Exchange, writing application software. And I was there for 9 years, close to 9 years, not quite 9 years. Then I became ill. I had heart problems. And it was a very tense job, very competitive. Everybody was half my age. Everybody had to prove that they can be, they can outdo the next person. And it was felt that I should not go on with this. And I was glad to leave. I must say I didn't feel sorry. It was really getting too much for me. And so I left. And I then looked for part-time work. After I recovered, it took, a while, several months before I was really all right again. And I then worked for a Jewish day school here in the neighborhood for a while. And then I got sick again. Anyway, I'm well again, and I'm now working at the Jewish Museum as the coordinator of volunteers. It's a volunteer job. I think I'm the only coordinator of volunteers in the city of New York, a cultural institution that does it on a volunteer basis. Most people, it's a paid job in most institutions. And I love it. I think it's wonderful. I like to be there. I like the people. I love to be appreciated for what I do. Where do you have a job where everybody says thank you, no matter whether you come or whether you don't come, whatever you do, it's wonderful. And I think I'm doing a good job. It's not just that they say thank you.
I'm sure. And do you have children?
I have 2 sons. One, my oldest son, is going to be 35, and he was married 2 years ago.
His name?
His name is Ralph David Schwartz, and his wife is Victoria. And my younger son is going to be 30 in a couple of weeks, and his name is Theodore Harold Schwartz.
And what do they do?
Ralph is in restaurant management, has studied in France for many years, and is now working in New York. And Teddy is a resident in neurosurgery at Columbia.
Any grandchildren?
No, not yet.
If there's one thing that you'd like to say before we end the interview, Is there anything specific you'd like to tell everyone that's going
Well,
to
I
get
also
to view
want
this?
to tell you about my husband.
Yes, please do.
My husband is a psychoanalyst. I'm going to cry before I continue. And he's given me more. He's given focus to my life and purpose and a lot of joy, which I would have never had without him. And 2 wonderful sons. And I wish I could stop crying.
What are some of the favorite things you like to do with your husband?
Well, most of the things that we do are really things that he loves, that I've learned to love through him. He loves opera and music. We love to go to movies and fine food, lots of nice restaurants and good home cooking. And going for a walk on the beach, which he loves more than I do, but I do it.
Which beach?
Oh, we have a house in East Hampton. Oh, and gardening. He loves gardening. I love the house, but
What kind of house is it?
it's a house right on the water, on the bay. It's very beautiful. And we have lots of nice vegetables and flowers that he grows.
Who decorated the house?
We do it together. Yes, we do all of this together. We always have a saying that if one of us doesn't like it, we don't buy it. We have to both like it. Otherwise, out it goes. Or we don't have it. And we go there every weekend, practically all year long. Not in the winter. I mean, in the winter we go every 2-3 weeks, but we are there a lot of the time.
Well, we're going to meet your family after this, but before we do that, is there anything else that you'd like to say?
Well, I don't. I was thinking before you came, I said to myself, why am I doing this? I'm still not sure why. And I'm actually afraid to look at it. I think I'm going to look at the tape and I'm going to say, oh my God, this can't be me. But I'm going to have to look at it. I won't ignore it. And I suppose I sort of feel grateful that Steven Spielberg decided to do all of this. And I have a feeling that it probably is as altruistic on his part as it seems to be. I mean, I have a sense that it really is, that he just decided this was a good thing to do. And maybe it is. I hope it is. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So this is the family.
This is the
Okay.
family.
Yes.
And we're going to start now. Would you introduce everyone from wherever
Okay.
you feel?
All right, this is my husband Lester, my son Ralph, my son Teddy, and my daughter-in-law Victoria.
Asking the children, what we like to ask them is, do you have anything you'd like to say about growing up as the child of a survivor? Start with.
I have some memories that I was thinking about as I drove over here. I thought I might mention. One was, I guess, the first time when I realized what my mother had been through. That when I was a child growing up, whenever she would talk about her experiences during the war, they always seemed like adventures to me, and I would always want to hear more about these adventures that I would like things you would see on television, and my mother wouldn't talk about them that frequently, only on certain occasions. And I recall the first time I really realized that they weren't just adventures was when I was at a Hebrew school class, and they had asked my mom to come speak. And I was sitting there with all my friends, and she was up in the front in our synagogue, and she started speaking about what had happened to her. And I remember she started crying. And my whole mood just instantly changed, because I was initially sitting there very excited with my buddies and wanting to hear what she said, and sort of, hey, cool, check out what my mom went through, And once she started crying, and it was obvious that these were such somber memories and such serious memories, that it wasn't just, they weren't just adventures anymore, but they were real experiences that I had to think about, and think about her in the context of those experiences. And I think they have definitely shaped this whole household. And growing up in this household, sometimes, and usually in unspoken ways, but occasionally in spoken ways. And there was something else I was thinking about was my brother and I, and my father as well, have all, whenever we are interested in a new experience, or excited about doing something new, or sort of taking risks, I guess, or traveling somewhere that might be dangerous, or engaging in some activity that has some sort of risk, or putting ourselves in some sort of situation that would be uncomfortable and unpleasant to be in, either emotionally or physically. I always had the sense that my mother her first impression was, why are you doing this? Why are you escaping from this comfortable place that we've created to put yourself...
Why go out of your way to do that?
Yeah, because I think to my mom, it was so important for her to be comfortable and to be surrounded by warmth, and to feel like things were secure, and we were constantly running away from that security and trying to experience new things and do new things, and I think it was, obviously she let us do them ultimately, because she's a great mom, but with a little trepidation at first, and a little sort of lack of understanding. And
Maybe
then,
more than a little trepidation.
Which she tried to hide, if she could.
Next.
Well, I think whereas, my brother's experiences with my mom's storytelling, or my mom's experiences, was sort of perceiving it as adventure and sort of seeing it as something to find out more about. I think I may have been more intuitive in terms of recognizing that it was something that was painful to her, and as a result would hear about it once or twice and then not really push it any further, not want to hear more about it, or be interested in hearing about it, but then in the same way that she would sort of step out of her daily persona, talk about what it was like then, and then step back into her daily persona, I would share in that experience and then forget about it. In the same way that she would forget about it, I'd say, oh, okay, fine, and then go ahead as if we hadn't had this conversation until it would come up again. But I also think that being the firstborn and the first one to want to go out and do different things, or the types of things that my brother was just speaking of, I was the first one to have her say, don't do that. I was a very, at least from what I've been told of my very early childhood, very active, very aggressive, and I was always constantly getting into things and running around and being very physical, and that was very anxiety-provoking for my mother, because she wanted me to be just the way I was, and very safe and very calm, and I'd be climbing the fence or running down the fence or running across the street or something, and she'd be screaming after me or whatever. I'm sure that I reacted to that. She would say no, and I would say yes, and she would say no, and I would say yes, and then that would manifest itself in any one of a number of different ways. spent a number of years riding and racing motorcycles, which made her very, very happy, I'm sure. And doing things like that, I guess, because there was a pervading sense that you shouldn't do that stuff, or it's not good to do, or why go out of your way for that. And, you know, it was, my mother went to such extremes and to such extents to give us a sense of security that we would just take it for granted.
Okay, we're interviewing Mara Schwartz. The interviewer is Karen Leeds. We're New York City, New York, US of A, and the language is English.
That's all I have to relate at the moment, I think. But there's no question that it certainly has had a pervasive influence on the way in which we grow up and the way in which we look at things and the way in which the way we feel about ourselves relative to each other and our past and ethnic heritage, as well as I think the way we view ourselves with respect to the rest of the world around us today.
When you decided to get married, was it something you discussed with your wife? Your mother's experiences before she met her, or did it come out after you were married?
No. It definitely was discussed before we were married. You know, it was something that, but that's, you know, that's part of, I don't think it was, I had to sit down and make a conscious decision that this is an issue that needs to be discussed. I think it was just a natural flowing from just getting to know each other, because it's, you know, part of me and us and who we are.
Who we are.
You know, if she was marrying into a family, she should know about the family.
How did it make you feel, Victoria?
I don't know.
Did you find it intimidating at all?
A little bit. Different culture than I was used to. I was brought up in a Christian household, and it was different in that our holidays were different, and I didn't know a lot about my husband and his family's heritage. Knew a little bit, and it was interesting, and oops. But aside from that, I enjoy it. I enjoy the holidays. I don't know.
It must have been interesting to find out actually that she had spent a lot of time in a Catholic surrounding in the convent.
Yeah, that was interesting. It was very interesting.
Now we come to Lester. Do you have anything to say, or would you like to relate about being married to a survivor, about what it was like to court a survivor? Or just a beautiful woman at that time?
A beautiful woman at that time. It would be, I could talk for far more than you have tapes, because it's, I think, turned out to be, I think when we got married, although I knew about Mara's background, at that point, and that was in the late 50s, I don't think I yet had any true sense of what the effect was going to be on everybody, what the effects really were for Mara, and what they would be for all of us. That is something that developed over time. I think at the very beginning, I think it was Mara wanted very much to be American, and wanted very much to put what had happened to her behind her. It became evident, particularly once we had children, and as her own sense of the past began to sort of crash in on her, it became evident that that was not going to be possible. And it started really a whole, there were certain books that she read, and certain which would lead to her weeping for periods of time, and things that she couldn't possibly watch on television, and are gradually becoming more involved in Judaism, or wanting to have some sense of Judaism for our family and our children. And as the years went on, it became more and more clear of just what it meant to be a survivor, and that it's something that is totally, it's pervasive. It affects the life of the survivor forever, and it affects the children as well. The children of survivors are different, live in a different world than the people around them. And I think our children who grew up with, you know, comfortable Upper West Side families, comfortable schools and so forth, began gradually to have a sense that they really were different from the other children, as much as they might have tried not to be, because their background was something totally different from what their friends' families, friends' mothers, had any sense of. So I think I'm a psychoanalyst, and over the years, I've come to, I've worked with people also who have had this experience, and I know how that it is, you know, people who are survivors lead a different life from the people around them. They're never safe.
I want to thank you all for coming and showing your support. Love it.
So do I. I do want to thank all of you for coming and being here with me at this point. It really means a lot to me.
Before we go, do you want to introduce us to the youngest member of the family who's been making
The
an
one that was
appearance?
making appearances and chewing.
Oh, two beautiful additions.
There you go.
This is
Lovely.
This is Gabby. This is Max. These are our two new pets. So,
Thank you very much.
yeah?
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. These are pictures of my grandfather and grandmother who were killed in Theresienstadt. His name is Alte Jankel Rosenkrantz, and her name was Zipporah Rosenkrantz. This picture was taken at the wedding of my mother's youngest brother. In the foreground, I'm a little girl of about 10 or 11. The bride and groom are, on each side of the bride and groom are my grandfather and my grandmother. In back of them is my mother and father, and on their side are my mother's sister and her husband, and my mother's brother and his wife. This was really the closest family I had in Vienna, and I was the only grandchild. This is a picture of my mother and father and me just before I left Belgium to come to this country. It was taken approximately in 1946. This is a picture of my friend Heinz Krawitz, who was killed in Auschwitz. This is my uncle, my mother's older brother, who was killed in a concentration camp, but we don't know which one.
What's his name?
I blocked on his name. His name was Bruno Rosenkrantz. This is actually the yellow star I wore. I think it was first given to me in 1942 when I lived in Tilf, and I had to wear it on all my outer clothing every day. This is Sir Marie Gonzague, who was of the Order of Les Sœurs de la Miséricorde in Charneux. And she was particularly nice to my mother when she was in the convent, and I knew her well. This is a picture of a priest whose name was Louis Jamin. He was l'Abbé Jamin, and he was very instrumental in helping me at the end of the war, the last few months of the war. I remained in correspondence with him for many years until he died in '61. This was the village priest in the village of Charneux, in whose house my father was hidden when he was in the upstairs of his house, and he had to make believe he was deaf and dumb because the downstairs was occupied by the Germans.
His name?
I don't know. This picture was taken in 1946 before I left Europe to come to America. And seems like a very strange person to me. This picture was taken a year or so after I came to this country, and it seems to me like my attempt to look American. Not too bad.
Okay.
This is taken in 1987 when Ralph graduated from a school in Paris, and he posed for this picture very reluctantly, although he looks like he's enjoying it.
I want to show these again.
This was also taken in 1987 when Teddy graduated. When was this taken, Lester?
Several.
Oh, this was
years ago,
taken
yeah.
in Vancouver, at a dinner in Vancouver.
The upper pictures were taken in St. Bart, I think.
And the upper pictures were taken last year in St. Bart.
Who is
Yes.
this?
This is Lester, and down below is Lester and I. These pictures were taken of my sons growing up. I think Ralph is in high school, and so is Teddy a few years later. This is a high school picture.